How many of you have ever played Mother May I? Wow. Surprised at how many people have. We should just, okay, everybody get up. And everybody get up. Everybody stand up. As you're able, everybody stand up. Choir. What did I say? Oh, yes, you may. Smart Alex. All right. So, the way this works is that I'm mother, okay? And I'm going to give you an instruction, and you want to follow mother's instructions. Normally, we would do this out on a lawn or in a space where you could move forward because the goal is to get towards the front, but we'll just practice it like this for the moment. You have to get permission, though, to do whatever it is that mother has asked you to do. So you have to say, Mother, may I? And I say, yes, you may. And if you do it before getting permission, then you sit down. Does that make sense? All right? Okay. So everybody pat the top of your head. All right. So the 12 of you that patted your head without saying, Mother, may I? Sit down. Yes, you may. So if you reached for your head before I said, yes, you may, then go ahead and sit down. All right. Rub your tummy. Okay, if you started moving to your tummy before you said, Mother, may I, then sit down. Mary Chris, you're out. Okay. Stop patting your head. All right, so if you stop patting your head, you're out. All right. Yes, you may. Okay. Wave like a bird. Very good. All right, you guys are catching on. Okay, you can go ahead and have a seat. So, yes, you may. Really simple children's game, right? About who's in charge. Now, you got to decide who's going to be mother and how the kids take turns, and that's where a lot of playground fights emerge, right, is because you've got the four alphas out on the playground or in the sibling cousin group that all want to be mother first, and then there's wrestling, and so you got to find some equitable way to decide who's going to get to be it first. And then that person goes, and then it's a process of learning to follow instructions. Now, I don't know this, but I wonder if the origin of this game is not exactly that some adult or group of adults said we need some fun way to teach children to follow instructions and to get permission before doing something. And so they created this game to teach children to learn to be obedient and compliant, right? Obedient and compliant. So you've got to listen for the instructions. You can only do what you're told. And then even after you're told, you still have to double check and say, may I? Is it really okay for me to do that? Yes, it's okay. Right? So rather than reaching for seconds, rather than reaching for that second drumstick, you have to ask, right? Or be told, everybody may get seconds now. And then you say, may I? May I really have seconds? Yes, you may. And you go ahead and you take that second drumstick and put it on your plate before your little sibling can get it. Ken? Well, I don't know. I think this is to offset Disney's compulsion to kill off mom at the very beginning of the movie, right? How many Disney movies at the beginning of the movie or even before the movie starts, mom is out of there? Oh, Bambi and Pixar movies, right? So maybe this is to help balance out that. I'm not really sure. That's a great question, though. Where is Dad's at work? That's where Dad is, right? This is a game probably from the 40s or 50s, maybe. I don't know. Those of you who didn't raise your hand saying you played were children before the 50s, and so maybe that's why you didn't play it. So I don't know. So this idea of who's in charge, how do we decide? And in our own lives, how do we decide who's going to be in charge? When children are growing up, that's one of the primary jobs of childhood and adolescence, is identifying who's in charge. Parents and other adults spend a lot of time with children, helping children learn the difference between who they should listen to and who they shouldn't listen to. And people you can trust. Your parents and your teachers and other authority figures, you can trust them. And so it's okay to do the things that they tell you to do. But when a stranger drives up in a van and offers you candy, you don't get in, right? You don't do that just because they're an adult doesn't mean they're in charge. You know, some of you, this is not true today, at least in the communities where I've been recently, but many of us grew up in neighborhoods where every adult in the neighborhood, when the kids are out playing, every adult just sort of had permission, tacit permission to not necessarily spank a kid, but certainly call a kid out for misbehaving. You wouldn't swat them, perhaps, but you would certainly say, hey, cut that out. You know, and then you'd go in and you'd get on the phone, right? And you let it, right? And depending on what community, it was 3 numbers or 6 numbers, and you'd call and you'd say, yeah, Jane, your little boy, your little girl is misbehaving. I thought you should know, and then hang up the... So, or maybe you had to call and get the operator, and she had to plug the things in. But that kind of idea, right, of who's in charge, and so communities and societies make those decisions about who's in charge. You know, it's interesting as we look at the story from Exodus. We find ourselves in a situation where the law has not yet been given. This people who think of themselves as God's people, the children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and we certainly, thousands of years later now, look back on them and think, oh, that's the people of God. That's the Hebrews, the Israelites, the nation of Israel. Well, it wasn't a nation yet. And they didn't have any rules. God had not given them any rules. God didn't give Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob a bunch of rules and say, okay, this is how you're going to worship me, and this is what you're going to do, and this is how you're going to behave. None of that existed yet. There were practices that were common to most religions and most cultures that had to do with how we worship and where we worship and how we conduct ourselves. And they went along with those things. All right, so when they went to Egypt, they didn't have to get rid of a bunch of other religious practices and exchange them for the ones of the Egyptians because they didn't have formal religious practices. They were just an extended family that wandered in because of the drought 400 years earlier. And so now we find them being called out of Egypt and being led towards a place of promise, and on the journey they're going to be formed. Hear that. Formation happens on the journey to the destination where God is leading us. Formation, development, maturity, discipleship, mentoring, these kinds of ideas happen on the way to the place God has prepared for us, to the place, the destination, the way of being that God has laid out in front of us. And we, on our journey, get formed. Which means what? That means that as we're going along, we're going to bump into each other, and we're going to trip and stumble, and we're going to get things wrong, and we're going to misunderstand, and it's going to be messy because we're not in formation yet. We're like a bunch of toddlers bouncing around the house. I was up early this morning. Our younger cat is not quite a year old, and she's like a toddler. Man, once she's up, she's just bing, 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 bouncing all over the place and up, and then she's down, and she's scooting through, and just crazy, just all over the place. And then we're like adolescents who mentally, they're still about this tall, but physically they're this tall. And so they're like Jar Jar Binks from Star Wars, kind of walking around like this and all arms and legs and stumbling. Any of you remember being that way? I have a couple of really clear memories of periods in adolescence when I kept bumping into door jams and things like that. I mean, I can see it, I know it's there, but I don't know how far out my body goes. And so learning to self-monitor is part of that growing and maturing process. Leadership and who's in charge also has to do with how we structure our relationship to each other under a government. And I want you to listen to a song This is from Hamilton. So today is the Gospel according to Hamilton Sunday, and there are 46 preachers in 46 pulpits preaching about the 46 songs from the Broadway musical Hamilton, an American Musical. And our song is I Know Him. This is sung by King George III at the time in which President George Washington has completed his term in office. So this is well after the revolution. Revolution? Yeah. Well after the revolution. And now it's time for a change in leadership. Okay, there's a leadership transition happening in the new nation. And this is King George thinking about that. Go ahead, Scott. So we've spent more than 200 years living under this system of government. It seems normal to us. And yet for thousands of years, the majority of established militarized nations, large productive economies that related across borders and across continents, the majority of those nations were under the leadership of somebody who claimed to be divinely appointed. Somebody who claimed that they were there because God put them there, and guess who's next? My son or my daughter, because God gave to our family this right of leadership and authority. So when we ask, well, who's in charge? Well, it's whoever God said was going to be in charge. And for us as citizens of the United States, that's really strange to think about it that way. But that clearly is the voice of King George III saying, what? Somebody can just yield power and there's not going to be a war, right? I mean, people fought and people died to determine who was going to be next. And the rest of the world often marvels at these smooth transitions of power that democratic nations have. And obviously, it's not always smooth and it doesn't always go as planned. And yet, that idea removes us, I think, from the biblical world, the biblical culture and context, and therefore the biblical worldview to a certain degree. Remember that this story from Exodus 16, we've got a bunch of descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's a giant family reunion, right? And so you have the normal ways of deciding who's in charge there. The people who are our elders, our oldest members of our community are going to be the ones who are in charge. And then they're under, of course, the leadership of Pharaoh. And Pharaoh claimed to be the sun god or the son of God, depending on how you interpret the hieroglyphics and depending on which epoch you're in, which dynasty. And so the idea of leadership and determining who's responsible is really challenging. There's a scene in Monty Python and the Holy Grail where King Arthur comes in, not riding, but going ahead, and his servant has got these 2 half coconuts, and they come across this hillside, and there's a castle up on the hill, and Arthur's trying to find out who is the lord of that castle. And he comes upon Dennis, who is a peasant who's at work in the soil, and they have this conversation about the government of a king versus the government of a democracy versus the government of an anarchic utopia, and all of these. So in this very little 3-minute scene, you have this analysis of systems of government and how we relate to power and authority. And several thousand years later, after the Exodus story, we have Jesus show up on the scene. And who's in charge is no more straightforward or simple now. You've got, again, the Roman government, you've got Caesar, and then Caesar gets to choose who within the local culture and community is going to be in charge. And so King Herod was really put there and authorized by Caesar. And within the religious community, you've got the sons of Aaron, who are the priestly tribe, and then you've got the Sadducees, and the scribes and these people who had privilege and power because of their knowledge and because they had been born into this caste, this class. And along comes Jesus, who there's a scene in the Gospels that's very similar to the words of King George there, where Jesus goes back to Nazareth and he's teaching and he's healing and he's preaching, and the people there in the community say, Jesus, I know him. That can't be. He's that little guy who spoke to me. The exact words from Hamilton coming right out of the pages of Scripture. Jesus had no right, by any measure that their culture used, to presume to step forward and exercise that kind of authority. He was considered a rabbi even in his local community, or they wouldn't have given him a platform to begin with. But he didn't have the authority to reinterpret. All he had the authority to do was echo and repeat and mimic what had already been said. And Jesus came in and reinterpreted the law and the Scriptures for a new day and a new time. And I wonder if when Jesus says, when the disciples are marveling at the things that Jesus does, and Jesus says, don't marvel at these things, for you're going to do even greater things than these. I wonder if one element of that was the church's ongoing responsibility to reinterpret the Word of God for each new day and time, for each new cultural context. It wasn't a static cultural relationship with the Word and with the community. It's constantly unfolding and developing over time. And you and I have a responsibility. Who's in charge? We still ask that question, right? As we grow up and mature from childhood to adolescence to adulthood, hopefully we move from external authorities and external reinforcement to internal authority and internal reinforcement, right? Hopefully, being mature means that I don't need other people to tell me what's right to do. I know what's right to do. And I don't need other people to make me do it. I'm internally motivated and internally regulated to do those things that are good and right and appropriate. And part of what got Jesus into so much trouble was that he was internally regulated, and all these people around him were trying to regulate him externally. And what he was doing and what he was saying ran contrary to their understandings. And so they argued with him, they tried to trick him, they resisted him, they tried multiple times and ultimately succeeded in killing him. Because he understood that this authority comes from within, but he also understood that the authority within is not self. The authority within is the Spirit of God that is planted within us and guides us. Guides us to live the way Ephesians chapter 4 invites us to live. Guides us to live in such a way that we may press against and even violate the norms of our culture and even sometimes the laws of our culture, because the law of God, the Word of God, the Spirit of God draws us in and leads us from a place of internal guidance, leads us to understand the responsibility that we have in our community and culture in a new way. And the church exists in part because this is not work we can do alone. This is work we must do in conversation and in community, so that while the community does not regulate us, we're self-regulated, we are responsible ultimately for our own lives. We don't hand over responsibility for our decisions to the church or to a leader in the church. We nonetheless think about and make those decisions and take those actions in covenant with the church, in covenant with the continuing expression of Jesus Christ in the world. And as we do that, the community does have the right to say, I wonder about that. I hear it and see it differently. Are you open to talking and listening about that together and exploring what God might want all of us to do? One of the challenges in our community and our culture is that people have not developed that self-regulation. And as we interact with the students at Maple Lawn, perhaps, and Rusk Middle School, one of the things we want to ask is, how do we partner with those families and those communities to together, not to, as the folks here at Central, to impose, but together to create environments where that self-regulation and that maturity can be developed. And how do we do that here in the congregation? We have 12-step groups that meet 5-6 days a week here at Central. And one of the things that those groups exist to do is to help people relearn self-regulation in the context of a community of nurture and encouragement and support. The community does not take responsibility for each member's actions. The sponsors don't take responsibility for each other, for their sponsees, and yet there's covenant relationship there and support and encouragement. As you and I go forward from this place, we're invited by God to ask, who's responsible here? To look at the situations of dysfunction and pain and suffering in our community and ask, who's responsible? And to wonder, how am I responsible? How am I complicit? How am I accountable? How can I take action to make a difference, to do something in the world? Maybe for a whole community, maybe for a whole people, maybe just for one. Maybe just for one kid or one family. But how can I do that? And what do I need as a follower of Jesus Christ, as part of this community, to enable me to do that well? With my friends and my family, with my coworkers and classmates, with my neighbors, and with the strangers I encounter in my day. Who's in charge? Ultimately, it's God that's in charge, and our goal and responsibility as followers of Jesus Christ is allow Him to dwell in us by faith, so that His love and His light shine forth in the world and manifest that sense of goodness and rightness and justice that God calls each and every one of us to live.